here that's hosting this webinar. So that's a coalition of diverse organizations and agencies all throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We have over 100 partners now that are engaged in land conservation and related fields in the watershed. And we really try to work to help our partners accelerate the pace of conservation as we try to equitably protect 30% of our Chesapeake Bay watershed from development by the year 2030. And so I also wanted to give thank you to our steering committee for their support, our co-conveners, but especially the supporters of this webinar that made this possible, the National Park Service. And without further ado, I wanted to kick it back over to Chase so that we can get into this webinar. We're so excited to have you all here and hope that you can learn a whole lot. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Ben. So let me go ahead and jump in here. So we are, seems like my housekeeping one is missing out of there, but I'm just going to go ahead and jump in to say a couple of quick things. During this webinar, we are going to have um, a few opportunities for questions. So we want to make sure that your questions get answered. You will be able to use the Q&A section to be able to put in any questions that you have. And then we will be able to respond to them live during the couple of quick breaks between each of our different talking point sections. We'll do a couple of those then, and also a larger question answering session at the end. Please note that anything that you type in there for question wise, if we don't get to it live, we do plan to answer all of these questions on the back end into a written form that we can then later share with you so that no one's questions will not be answered. We want to make sure that everyone can get that addressed. Feel free to share also with anything in the chat as well. And just note that as we're going through, if you we'll have a break time halfway through, so there will be a scheduled break, a small break period there for you to be able to utilize that. And I just recommend you participating with us. We can also allow you to ask your question live with pulling you up on the screen during that section where we ask for questions. So if you'd like to ask your question in person on the camera, please let me know, and I can have you given access for that. With that being said, though, I want to turn that over now to Carolyn and Susan to introduce themselves and get us started off here.
Susan, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. So I am Susan Stevenson. I'm the Director of Federal Business Development with Chesapeake Conservancy. What I wanted to highlight about myself and what I think makes me unique in the development world is I come out of a program background. So I've been working in development only for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was a program person who had grants dumped on my lap to go, here, go find money and then implement it. So really have experience with the soup to nuts of finding grants, writing grants, and then also implementing, and then the sensitivity of being a program person to having to balance doing the development side, learning on the fly. Hopefully a lot of the lessons learned and little tidbits that Carolyn and I share with you will help. There are lots of resources out there for writing grants, but we're hoping to try to give a lot of those insights from years of experience to help you do better, be more efficient, and not pull your hair out at the end of the day. Carolyn?
Thanks, Susan.
Sure.
My name is Carolyn, and I have been a consultant with the Conservancy for a number of years now. And prior to that, I was Director of Grants and Programs for the National Park Foundation for more than 12 years. So I think my unique perspective is the work I've done is both seeking grants and awarding grants. I've been lucky enough to wear both hats in my career. And so the seeking grants, we, sought funding from individuals, foundations, federal, state sources. And then as we raised the funds, we would in turn then give the funding out to partners and parks across the country. So I having reviewed thousands and thousands of applications each year, I have a good sense of what works and what doesn't to secure funding. So that's in a nutshell. And of course, it's hard to condense all these decades of experience into just a few short hours. So we'll do our best to kind of touch on some highlights and some tips, and whatever, like Chase said, we don't get to, we'll try and address afterwards and give you as many resources as we can. So anyway, with that, I'll dive right in. We're just going to go through and kind of hit on some planning information, identification and alignment of potential grants. We'll talk about application process, award acceptance, implementation, compliance and reporting, and then close out. So Chase, if you want to bump to the next one. So registrations, we won't go into a great detail here, but there is a sequence of events, and some of you sound like you've applied for federal grants before, so you're well familiar with this, but there's a certain order. If you're new to this, there's certain things you have to have in place before you can even begin to apply. So the first, if you don't already have it, is you're going to need a Dun & Bradstreet registration. All of these are free, so there's, don't worry about cost, but you have to have a formal business identifier, and that process can take up to 30 days. So if you're looking at a grant that's due in 2 months, better get going. The organization that's central to all things government is SAM.gov, System for Award Management. You need your DUNS number in order to apply for SAMs. So once you get your DUNS, immediately start registering for SAM, and that will give you a unique identifier number, and that can take up to a month to get that process going and approved. And then after that follows grants.gov, and that's where you're going to be looking for your grant opportunities and doing your applications, etc. So if you can flip to the next one, Chase. And then another portal you'll need to sign up with is Grant Solutions. And this is for federal agencies through the full grant cycle, from pre-award to the application to the award and closeout. So it's kind of a soup to nuts portal. Again, that one's going to take about 30 days. All of this now ties to login.gov, which is very fast. Once you have sam.gov, login.gov, and grants.gov, that one will just take about a day. And then if you want to start with USDA and the, agriculture and forest grants, they have their own portal, which is quite fascinating. Quite a process to get engaged with. And that one will take about a week. So we just kind of want to, for those who are new to this, give you a heads up that there's a lot of prep work to do before you can even apply.
And to do it when you're thinking about applying for a grant. So before a NOFO, a notice of funding opportunity, or a request for proposal, or any kind of agreement opportunity, funding opportunity hits the streets, you want to have all this stuff in place. We've certainly worked with partners before and been in the position where we've had to scramble and try to do this while you're writing a grant. It's really, really difficult. And sometimes you just run out of time. And that's a real shame to put all that investment into putting a proposal together and then not being able to submit it. Can be very frustrating. So I would say if you're thinking of doing a grant, go through, get all this set up. That way you don't have that aggravation while you're trying to do a proposal at the same time.
Yep. Chase, you can next.
So once you're all set up and you're ready to put in applications, where do you find it? Where are the funding sources? So we're going to take a quick tour of grants.gov in a second. That's one place to look for grant opportunities. We're going to also look at Grant Solutions. That's another place where a lot of federal agencies now are posting grant opportunities. To me, grants.gov and Grant Solutions kind of do the same thing, although different agencies tend to go toward one or the other for their actual proposal process. Certainly state programs, your local departments of natural resources, your local environmental agencies, your local departments of energy can all be sources of grants. They sometimes are a whole maze of finding where the grant opportunities are. but certainly look at those. And then there's the foundational opportunities. Certainly looking at any federal agency listservs, EPA, Department of Energy, USDA, all of those will often have listservs for funding or grant opportunities that they'll send out. That way you don't find out about them 3 or 4 weeks later, and you only have 3 or 4 weeks to write the proposal. So you want to find those sources and be notified if you're not kind of stalking websites for when a specific opportunity is going to be available. And then CCP has some resources as well. Chase, do you want to touch on that real quick? You or Ben?
Yeah, so we are currently working on a federal funding navigator, which will allow our partners to be able to easily navigate some of the major federal funding sources to find what is going to fit best for their particular needs and this is going to be more tailored toward land conservation. So what will help is to not only provide the general info and the links and things that you would normally look for when trying to navigate different sites that have this information, but it also will provide information that's tailored to understanding what is the size of these grants, what is the requirements that would be that I might not normally know about, or some of the things that would help me to better understand capacity or other things that might limit whether or not this would be the best fit for me, or to find a more creative way to use a grant that I might not normally think of with that to be able to do this. So this is something we're working on to be able to present and utilize. And currently we have action alerts that go out for that. So we did our first one back in January for Chesapeake Wild, and we are going to be releasing another one shortly for America the Beautiful. If you're not on our network with the CCP, if you would like to join and become part of our partner network to get some of these action alerts as they come out, feel free to reach out to me after this webinar. We would love to get you connected and to get you more information with that. With that,
And Chase, can you give me power to share my screen so I can go into
yes.
grants.gov?
There you go.
Okay.
You stop sharing.
Okay, so this is, when you go to grants.gov, this is their landing page. I'm going to go in and log in. So this is assuming that you've already gone through the login process and SAM and your unique identifier and all those things. So you're ready to get in into grants.gov and to either search for general opportunities or for specific opportunity that you know has been released, and then certainly to also apply. So I'm going to click login, and you'll see how this login.gov has been like layered on top. It does make it a little easier once you have it all set up. I think it'll be a little overwhelming if you're doing it from scratch, but once you have all the various portal access and the login.gov set up, it does make it a little easier. So I'm going to click the login.gov. And I'm signing in through login.gov. I will say for grants.gov, it is a 2-part authentication. Usually it would send a code to my phone and I'd have to type that in. But since I've already been logged in recently, it doesn't make me do that again. So most of these systems now will have a 2-part authentication, usually through your phone number. You can do it to an email. I do it to my phone because then it's just easy to enter it. So this is what my homepage looks like in grants.gov. You can see it's got my name, it's welcoming me. I can learn about different grants. There is a grants 101 on here. A lot of these federal resources and sites have 101s about their program, how to set up, all those types of things. You don't have to be logged in to do that. But I just wanted to call attention to that. So if you want to search for grants, you're like, what's out there? Right now I've been watching for one in particular from EPA. So I don't know what the opportunity number is going to be. So I would just put EPA into the keyword, click search, and then it shows me all of the various EPA grants that have been posted. If you're looking for something that's old or archived, you can look and sort that way. But right now I'm just looking for open opportunities. They are usually listed by the date that they were posted. And if you want to see if something's closed, you can do, various sorting kind of opportunities there. Once an opportunity is out there, I'm just going to click on this one and show you what comes up, what you can kind of take a look at. It'll show you version history. Sometimes the agency will update, if they'll change something, tweak something, maybe they'll update a deadline. That's usually the biggest version change, is that they extend the deadline for the proposal of when it's due. Any related documents. This is the full announcement, so you could click on that, download it. It comes in a PDF. I often will take, when I go through and read a proposed RFP or a NOFO, I use a highlighter in PDF just to kind of pick out the important things. And then the package, this just shows when things were opening, closing, and various ways to access that information. So back to the synopsis. This gives you a lot of good key information if you're just kind of looking at a potential funding opportunity. Of course, the date it was posted, if there were any updates, always check for updates. Sometimes there'll be a frequently asked question guide that they'll update. When it's due, closing date, that is key. And again, that's usually the item that will change the most, is that closing date, it'll be extended. And then it'll tell you the estimated total program funding. That's how much they have available to give out, not necessarily how much you can get. And if there's an award ceiling or floor, meaning you have to at least have a grant of, for this one, $0, which is great. And then in some cases, the award ceiling, it can't be any more than 3 million, which is also really, really useful. So this is just generally one way to look for an opportunity. And I'm going to go back to the search grants. And if you knew, like if somebody had emailed you saying, hey, this is open, but they didn't have a link to it, and you wanted to look it up by the funding opportunity number, you could take that number and it would, it's a series of numbers and digits, and put that in the opportunity number, and it would take you directly to that specific opportunity. Sometimes if you already have downloaded it, maybe you haven't kept the RFP, occasionally I do that, and I need to go find it, I can pull that opportunity number and just go directly to it. So once you've found your opportunity and you want to go ahead and apply, I was going to just show very quickly, back to my account page. What grants.gov is, it sets up what is called a workspace. And one thing that is nice about the workspace is if you have multiple people within your organization that are working on the grant, you can each have access to the workspace. Now, one person will have the ability to actually click submit and to control that workspace, but you could have multiple staff working on a given grant that they have specific responsibilities for. So that is one of the nice options for the workspaces. So I'm going to go find one of our recent grants that we've submitted. Want to make sure that it's one that is still open. So this gives a last activity date. It shows we can search by, if I want to find something that's really old, I could change the date and find something we submitted a year ago if I want to pull information out of that. These are all the searchable. If I'm looking for a different entity, workspace ID, you can search by a whole lot of things. I generally just click and do by date for my most recent opportunities. So I'm going to open one that we have that's open, that we're currently working on, just to kind of show what that workspace looks like. So I'm going to click manage. And this shows, these are the various items that have to be submitted for this specific grant. These are always different. You will see some commonality. The federal assistance application, the 424, that is standard. You will see that in there. These can be downloaded and filled out offline and then uploaded into the system, or they can be directly loaded into the system. Some of them you can actually, over here, you'll see where you can reuse a form. So if you have 90% of your information listed in that 424, you don't have to re-put it in every time. You can just reuse an old form. Now you have to be really careful that you change the title and the various items on it, but it's just a way of saving some keystrokes and saving you a little bit of data. You'll see some of these, they'll indicate mandatory. Sometimes they'll say they're optional. So you do need to pay attention to that. You cannot submit unless everything that's mandatory has been uploaded. It won't let you, the system won't let you submit. If you are working with multiple staff, you can lock and unlock so that somebody else can't overwrite your information if you're controlling the workspace, which is really nice. And then there are some that are just a read only. As you open it, you read through it, and then it'll say it's complete and it's been passed. So do be careful, make sure that if it's a read only, you do really read it and you understand what you're signing up for. And then the other thing, and not particularly in this federal system, some of the other systems, sometimes when it says it's complete, make sure you really know it's complete. Sometimes things if you just open it and close it, it'll say it's complete. It's not really complete. haven't put yourself in there yet. So just be careful of that on some other systems. This federal system generally does not do that. So that's just the 10,000-foot view of grants.gov. So I can stop sharing, and Chase, we can go back to our presentation.
Sounds good.
I'm just looking for where I was on the page. Okay. You can go to the next slide.
And just.
And
it's a-
Carolyn, I think this goes back to you.
Yes, thanks. So in addition to just searching, you know, the portals and application portals and websites, etc., I think once you identify some potential grants that you want to go through, it's a really good idea to reach out to the technical leads and talk to them about the idea for your program and what you have in mind. They are super, super helpful, I've found, in helping you determine whether your project makes sense or how to refine it to make sense, see if it's a fit. And oftentimes, if it's not a fit for this one, they know a lot of other people in the industry, so they might point you somewhere else. So you can talk to past technical leads, current technical leads. And another thing to do that's really important is to review who was funded in the past to see what they're actually funding and who they're actually funding, and the types of projects they're actually funding. So this is where you put your little Sherlock hat on and do a little bit of digging and detective work to see if what you're thinking really makes sense and really has a chance. Because it's a lot of work to go to if it's an outlier. So, Chase, if you want to. Oh, I think now we're on a question break.
Yes, so we are at a question break here. So if anyone has any questions about what we've covered so far, feel free
Your
to drop
headset,
it.
Chase, your headset.
Sorry about that. So we're at a question break here. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it into the Q&A and we can ask those live here. If not, we can keep going, but I'm going to give everyone just a few minutes here. We'll give another 4 or 5 minutes if anyone has any questions, and then we'll move forward.
And I was going to say too, I do see that a couple people had some very specific things they're looking for funding for, like stormwater and trails. We're not putting specific links necessarily in this
Webinar.
presentation, but I can certainly add it. We're going to do a kind of a Q&A and FAQs
Mhm.
afterwards and create a resource sheet for you so we can add some ideas. But just broadly, I would say when you're searching for things, the main thing you're looking for is your keyword, you know, stormwater, trail, ADA accessible, etc. And that will really hone in on the donors and the opportunities that are available for that specific theme.
Yeah, and just building on that, Carolyn, when you talk about like the keywords like stormwater or trail, stormwater and trail can come up under a lot of different federal agencies and a lot of different programs. So you might have in your mind, oh, I'm going to go for NPS or I'm going to go to XYZ agency, but I type in trail and I'm like, oh, there's funding through Department of Education for a trail, or, you know, that might have that kind of accessibility or might have that match with the program. So don't just be limited by kind of a predisposition to a certain agency of where you think you should get funding. Sometimes I think the projects that can be the most successful come in kind of not a backdoor, but sometimes those are very appealing to those agencies because it's a different group they're working with, could be a different geography they're working with, and they like to have those expanded types of groups and not keep funding the same entities again and again.
Yep.
Well, I think, oh, there is one question here. All right, so Jenny asks, how are applicants judged? Are they well formatted, documents ranked higher, and what factors should make sure we include?
we're actually going to go into that in more depth as we move through the presentation. So if we don't specifically answer your question as we move through it, please ask again if there's anything more specific or something we didn't quite address. But we will be talking about the application process and what things they're looking for. So,
But I would say generally things that are well presented. So you don't have 30 million different fonts. You have your narrative, for example, is well written, doesn't have a lot of typos. Anything that distracts from what you're asking for, whether it's visual or written, is just going to take away from your proposal. So really cleanly written. When I say not lots of fonts, you know, using 2 or 3 different fonts. I tend to be really sensitive to those kinds of things. So you don't want to have like 10 different fonts in it and highlights and italics. And I tend to really like things that are rag right, that aren't full justified. It makes it much easier to read. Fonts that are, this is getting in the weeds, you'll cut me off, Caroline, I can see you, that are serif fonts, meaning anything with like serif or like little duders on them, like Times New Roman's a great serif font. Those are great for body text because they're easier on the eye to read. When you get into sans serif fonts like an Arial or something like that, they can be a little more difficult to read. So those are really nitpicky. Those aren't going to kill you either way, but just, I try to make it as easy for folks to read as possible.
and,
You know,
and
giving
sometimes they
space
actually
and-
specify what.
Sometimes they do, 100%, and
Yeah.
never go below, like, I don't think I've ever seen anybody allow below 10-point font. Super hard to read, although some fonts are not naturally smaller. Times New Roman is naturally smaller than Arial. So if you have a tough word count or page length or something like that, that is a great font that tends to be more naturally compressed. It's easily readable, gives you a little more space. So, okay, we can go on to next, but we can dive into some more of those later too. But great question.
I do have one other one here that we can jump on from Karen. And Karen, feel free if you want me to put you on because you have a follow-up with this, feel free to let me know in the chat. But said, I have had trouble with the logic model. Do you have any tips for that?
I think logic models are a challenge. I think especially I've seen that in like EPA environmental education grants in particular, and they're like their own little beast. And the way I've gotten through those is reaching out to the technical leads. Now I know you can't do that when those grants are open, the RFPs are open for solicitation, but maybe going back through and reaching out and trying to understand what works, or ask them if they give you a sample of something that they really liked in the past. Because all those logic models tend to have a little, from agency to agency or program to program, like a little bit, they're just nuanced in what they look for. So I think reaching out to those technical leads when the RFP isn't open and trying to work through what they're really looking for examples. But they're tough.
They are tough. And I'd say just generally, you know, the goal is, you know, what's going to change in the world when you do your project. And then sometimes people interchange the words outcomes and objectives, or goals and objectives. So you have to kind of make sure you look at the semantics of what they're looking for. And it needs to just make sense, you know, like, here's the change we're trying to make in the world. Here's the broader outcomes that will lead to that change. And here's the specifics of how so it builds on itself. You kind of build it backwards. And that's just a broad brush. And there are lots of resources on logic models, but I think just broadly, that's how I've always approached them. It's like kind of working backwards, like what's going to change the game? What are some indicators and outcomes that would let us know we're getting there? And then what are the specifics that help us measure it? So I hope that helps.
Excellent. Well,
Yeah.
I don't think we have any more questions popping up at this moment, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next section. And any further questions, feel free to jump in the chat or drop in the Q&A.
Okay. So one of the things you'll need to do as individual or organization is determine whether when you're reviewing an RFP, whether it's from a foundation, the state grant, a Fed grant, you need to see if it really makes sense for you. So there's kind of two layers about filters that we go through. One is logistical. Are you eligible? You know, it'll flat out tell you in the Fed grants, there's a section called eligibility. And some applications are open to nonprofits, some aren't. Some are open to schools, some aren't. So you really need to look at that. And then, can you meet the minimum threshold, which sounds weird, but if a grant's, you know, wanting you to spend or have a project for a minimum 200,000 and you only need 20, you can't do it. Or is it a multi-year grant for millions of dollars? Is that what you need? And is that funding level adequate? And then the due date, it sounds like an obvious thing, but usually, you know, for these type of grants, we try and allow at least a month, better off 2, even better 3 or 4, to start pulling all the components together. So do you actually have time to do it? And then the funding opportunity, you actually have to read it word for word. And there's, in the synopsis section, you know, it might sound really great and like a perfect fit because it's got the word stormwater in it or trail in it. But then when you read the specifics, it may be just in a certain geographic region, or it may be this type of trail or this type of funding, or, you know, like solar projects, you know, it might be to install solar panels on a parking garage, not a brand new solar panel in a field. So you really have to look at very specifically all the details of what they're saying in that funding opportunity. And then most folks will host webinars to talk about what they're looking for in the grant. And usually they record them. It's better to attend in person so you can ask your own live questions. But if you can't do that, in the very least, review the webinar that they post online so you get inside information on what they're really looking for. And then determine the fit for your project. Are you trying to smash a square peg into a round hole, or is this grant fund going to actually advance your mission? Or is it going to make you, give you mission creep? And then if you have specific questions, definitely send them. There's always a main contact, a technical lead for FAQ. So it's better to do the work up front to find out if it's a fit or not than it is to try and get into it and then be turned down. So the logistical go, no go is one set of criteria. And then Chase, if you'll move to the next slide. The next, I'm sorry, due date. Yeah, due date, we wanted to dive in because there's a lot more to the due date than you think. So is there time to complete a good application? Like you have to really write and hone and tighten up what you want to say, write your logic models, etc. The other considerations is if you're going to need a lot of collateral material and partner support letters, they have to have time. You need to create templates and you have to have time for them to respond and write the letters for you. Do you actually have the bandwidth internally with your development team and your program staff to pull this together? Or is everybody already, you know, stressed and overcommitted? Are there vacations people are on or other commitments that, you know, happen in the timeline of when you're trying to write this? Like if you're depending on a program person and they're gone for 2 or 3 weeks in the middle of this, that impacts your ability to write this project or program. And do you have to get management or board approval for submitting these things? And you need to allow, you know, weeks for that as well. So the due date can be a very big deal. Right, Chase?
Yeah, I just wanted to add some other things to think of. And we are coming from a federal kind of lens, but we've also kind of like dipped in some other requirements for other types of grants, foundations or private grants or whatever that we've seen that can kind of catch you up. But in that reviewing the due date, there could be things that you need to get a survey for a piece of land that you want to acquire, and it's going to take 5 weeks, and the grant's due in 4 weeks because you found out about it. It was already been out a couple weeks. So those are the kinds of things we like to make sure that we think through before we're like, yeah, everybody, let's go. We're going to go for this proposal, so that we don't get 2 or 3 weeks down the road and be like, we can't do it. We just don't have the time. And those board approvals, either internally for yourself, or that you have to have a resolution that says your executive director or president can actually sign it. Those things can take time. Some organizations are more nimble. So we just try to give a heads up of those things can creep in. And usually those requirements, Carolyn, I'm sure you agree, like they're buried. I'm like, I wish they would have those up front so that you don't miss them as you're kind of rereading through the application requirements. So just a heads up on those things. And then we wanted to talk about, just reviewing the funding opportunity. And we called out a couple of those things and kind of the go, no go, because we thought they were so super important. The reviewing the due date was one of them. And then this read it word for word. And I don't know how, I've been guilty of it. I know Carolyn's been guilty of it, where I get all excited. I'm like, let's go. And then I read in detail. I'm like, it doesn't fit for eligibility or whatever. It's so important not to skim announcements, even if it's an application for a grant you've done before. They change from year to year or from cycle to cycle, little bits, tweaks here and there. So I really, when I read something, even if I've applied before, try to look for what's different. What are the nuances? What is the direction? What are the changes? All the requirements are not always like listed, like here's everything that you need to submit. That is usually about 80% of it, but usually in the rest of the application, especially in the federal side, I've seen recently where they're including in the NOFO or RFP, where they're like, talk about your NICR rate, tell us how this isn't duplicative. And they're statements, and they're not hard, but they're things that if you scramble at the end or you don't have them, sometimes they won't review your application. Sometimes they'll come back and say, hey, you need to put these 4 things in. And you just want to have that all done up front and understand what the requirements are. So in that little list of, here are the, you need to have your federal application, you need to have a budget, you need to have a letter of support, you need to have bios. Look for any other things. NICR letter, which is your negotiated indirect cost rate, or if you're going to do a de minimis rate of 10%, they usually want to see that. Like, assume the federal grants are going to want to see that. If they don't ask for it in the application, they will ask for it at some time if you get awarded. So just give it to them up front, makes it easier. And to keep track of all this, make a to-do list of all the required items so you don't miss something. So that you don't do it and then not load it, and just tracking that information. So incredibly important. And then I already said, even if you've applied in the past or a different cycle, make sure you read through. It's just so incredibly important. I feel like I'm preaching. I'm sorry.
You're excited.
Go ahead, Chase, you do the next slide. Okay. Next slide, Chase. Okay, so
We
hold on,
missed.
let me see. Nope, I think you went too far. Unless something got.
Yeah, that one.
Oh, there it is. Yep, there it is. Okay, so we talked about kind of the first go, no go, like the logistical. And then we wanted to talk about kind of separate, we broke this out, kind of the alignment and the mission. Like, does it make sense? And this is a really big, I think, hard, challenging point for a lot of nonprofits, because we have trouble. I have trouble saying no, that this isn't a great idea, or we don't want to do this, because it can't, we can see where it fits and it's a really good project, or a partner wants us to come in with them and we want to work with them. But really, to keep yourself focused and efficient and on target, to go back and make sure that there's alignment with your mission. So we go through internally at the Conservancy a bunch of kind of questions. This isn't all of them, but these are the things that we look at. So just highlighting a couple. Going back, starting the basics. Does it align with your mission? Does it really feed and move your mission forward? Does it fill a gap, a place where you want to work? Can you do the project for the budget they've given you? A lot of times we'll see grants and we're like, oh, that's a great project, but it doesn't, we can't do it for $100,000. We need 150. Do we have other sources of funding to make that project whole? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And you don't want to put in a budget because that's just drive your staff crazy. It'll overwhelm your organization. It's just not good practice. And it's okay to say no, that this isn't a good fit. Sometimes it's hard when you have a manager or an executive director or president going, I want this. And you're like, it doesn't fit for XYZ reason. So these are just some of the questions we look at. You know, again, do we have the capacity? Do we have the staff in-house? Do we have to hire new people? I always try to push back and look at the timing. You know, you can put in a federal award or put an application. We put in one tomorrow. We might start work on that early fall. So just kind of understanding the timing of things, and then how long do you have to do the project? And then if you need to bring in any external commitments, you know, whether it's staff or skills or equipment, software, any of those kinds of things, just to make sure that it makes sense to move forward with the application. Next slide. We call it out again, just attending those webinars. We just think they're really, really important. Not just to get an understanding of the overall, what are they looking for, you know, any things they want to call out, but, you know, listening to the presenter's language. They will be very specific in the text that they use. And when you put in an application, use that text. That's something that resonates with them. So the wording and language that you use, I try to pay a lot of attention to. If I hear things that are repeated again and again and again, I try to take little notes of like, I'm hearing this like 15 times. This clearly is a way that they look at their program. And if you speak to them in that same text, I think it resonates better, and you'll hopefully score higher. You know, webinars generally give you areas of emphasis, areas of focus, kind of a lot of times those are led by the key program staff. And they give you a really good idea of the directionality of they're looking to go for. So you want to make sure that you're, you know, attending those, really listening for those language and text cues and the directions they're looking to go. You of course get opportunities for Q&A. And a lot of times I've learned more from the questions other people have asked than the questions I have of my own, because I'm, you know, I'm weeds, you know, down in the weeds, and I hear other questions come up, and those can be really, really useful. I always read the FAQs that often are generated either from a webinar or from the RFP technical staff. They'll post an RFQ or FAQ. Sorry, FAQ. I'm getting my acronyms mixed up. They'll post an FAQ, frequently asked questions. And those are really, really useful. Again, what others ask, as well as getting your own questions answered. Sometimes they do cut off when they update those, like 2 weeks before an application's due. So just kind of be aware of that. And then, you know, the presenters are their experts in their area. If you can get a hold to chat with them, either if you're not successful, maybe chat with them about their program interests and what they really want to see funded. You can always go back to them. They're great, really, really good resources.
And you just made me think of something too, Susan, like as these reviewers, like I know we always hope we can get feedback on what worked and what didn't work in our application. And to be honest, I remember there were some applications that we had over 1,000 applicants, you know, people really don't have time. It's not a lack of desire to be helpful. They just might not have time or bandwidth to be able to do that. So it's more on the front end where you can get help as opposed to the back end.
Yeah. And those, even when you can get like post-grant debriefs when you haven't been successful, they over the last like 15 years have become more and more restrictive because of competition concerns of what they will share. It's always useful if you get the opportunity and staff will meet with you, always take that opportunity, but sometimes they're really useful and sometimes they're not. But getting those discussions going between cycles, I think, is probably where you're going to learn the most information.
Yep.
Okay, next slide. Jace?
I thought it already changed. Let me just double check if it didn't.
There it is. Yep, we're seeing it now.
Sorry, it takes a slight delay for it to change.
Carolyn, you're up for this one?
Okay. So the application process, woo, so it's time to get organized. And you're going to need to really review the portal and look at every single section in the portal, application portal, to find out exactly what you need to pull together. There's probably a lot of templates that they might want you to use for narrative, the budget, the letters of support. There's certainly a lot of forms that you're going to need to fill out. You know, there's application forms, budget forms, lobbying forms, NICRA forms, you know, logic model forms. Sometimes they say they want optional items, which may be optional, may be required. Things like maps, photos, titles, surveys, permits, etc. Really, really look at the fine print on how they want, what they want included and how they want it presented. Sometimes you might, for your letters of support, you might need, if they want 5 or 6 or 7 letters, they might want you to scan those and upload them as one PDF document. Resumes, they might want everybody's resume uploaded as one document, etc. A question we had before on how you really write to a grant, they all have criteria and evaluation. So they have review rubrics or evaluation criteria. They will actually list that out and tell you this section is what we're looking for and what we've told our reviewers to look for. And this section is worth this many points out of 100. This section, here's what we're looking for, and it's this many points. And you know, it's kind of a no-brainer to say, you know, if something's worth 25 points, spend more time on that than the 5-pointer if you're really trying to portion out your time. But really, you know, model the language of what they're, to Susan's point earlier, mimic back the language and the criteria and what they're looking for. You know, just use their language and answer the question. It's amazing to me how many people will just write what they think we want to hear instead of answering the question. It's just answer the question. And then really look at all the deadlines and what's needed for submission. And with your team, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, create a proposal kickoff call with all the different team members. And we're going to show you a to-do list, a sample to-do list of what we use in a minute. But you have to really, 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 I like Susan's idea of using the highlighter, like what's important, what's needed, what are my action items, what do I need to pull together? And then what's the timeline of who's in charge and what's the timeline for all that? So if we want to go ahead and skip to the to-do list, Chase, that would be great.
Yeah, if you can just give me screen sharing powers.
I just stopped sharing so you can share your screen.
Okay. Got it. Okay. So we titled that last slide, Get Organized. So before I showed the to-do list, this is an example of one of my actual folders. It's a National Fish and Wildlife Federation grant we just put in last week. And it's just the way I organize all of my folders. This one happens to be in Google Drive so that we can all get to it if our local server gets a little cranky or you have internet issues. So we do a lot of things in Google Drive and then move them to our shared server for kind of archiving. But I have like my RFP and templates. This is anything that I get from my funder goes in there. It's referenced. That way I don't have to go, oh, I need to go look this up and go look it up again. Or somebody else on my team doesn't have to go find it. It's all in one place. I set up a narrative folder, a budget folder, letter support folder, photos and maps. That's kind of specific for these NIFWIF grants. The tables, and then any required forms that we had to have in there, I just put them all in. Sometimes there's required forms I don't have, I just keep in a very quick, what I call a grab and go file. So if it's a negotiated indirect cost rate, or if it's my board of directors, or, you know, there's a handful of things like that I have in there that I just audits. A lot of funders want to see your audits, your single audit, any of those things. I just keep those in and I can just load them into that required form file or attachments file. So for this, I have a to-do list that's here. I'm going to open up in a second. I also have a portal entry sheet. For the federal forms or the grants.gov, generally don't need that portal entry. For some other grants, I've found it very, very helpful for myself and my team. I put all the information in that portal entry sheet as it's required. and then I can just upload it all at once. It just helps keep myself organized and my team organized. So I'm going to show the to-do list. I'm just going to click and open that up. It isn't rocket science. It really isn't, but it's so important because if we don't have it, we go a little crazy. So I just have the task, whoever the task lead is, when it's due, and kind of a status. You'll see, because this one was submitted, it's all complete. Happy, joy. We have some of our administrative things that literally you would think, oh, you don't have to put that on to-dos. I do that one. It's almost like staring at that blank piece of paper that you don't have to write. It's really easy to set up the to-do list, get my Google files. We have an internal thing called Slack we use for individual grants for keeping track, so we're not going through email or through other different means. Everything about a given proposal is in that one little channel. Email threads can get a little hard to manage, so we use Slack just kind of internally. Who the proposal lead is, meaning that's kind of the program lead on the program side. If you have a program team you work with, there are times where I'm the program lead and I put that in there as I'm the program lead and I'm the development team lead. So just knocking those off, it just helps get you jump started. And then if we have to have interim or check-in calls, I usually include those too, so that I can schedule those ahead of time. Sometimes we do them, if it's a really big grant and a lot of moving parts, we might do them weekly or every 2 weeks. It really kind of depends on the size and the complexity of the grant. Other key things I put on my to-do list. In the past, I've been very detailed of if I needed certain reviews by people. I would even put a review block on their schedule so they have the time to review my stuff so it gets done and I get it back. So definitely the narrative, setting up a template is very, very important, assigning sections, and this would all be gone over at the kickoff call. If you have yourself and another staff member, if it's just you, I kind of would schedule that kickoff call kind of internally for myself. So this is my go date when I start working on the grant. Do the same thing for the budget, with a budget, like an internal budget narrative or an internal budget document, however you prepare a budget. I will show kind of ours later on, as well as how it links to a federal form. Any match or leveraging that you need to have either is required or that you want to include. If you do list match on a federal grant on the 424A, you are then you're committed to it. And if you were to list match often and then not bring that match to the table, your federal agencies are going to take note of it. So just be very cautious when you put match on there that's non-federal and you're committing to bring that to the program, to the project, you are on the hook to bring it. And it can be very difficult for the program officers of that grant if awarded, if you can't bring that match. So just take that with with a lot of caution. Make sure you can bring it. This is letter of commitment, letter of support. We do a draft of these that we provide to any of our partners. It just makes it a lot easier for them to provide that letter back to us in a timely fashion. I know when we get requests to be a partner, really appreciate having that template. And we're going to show one of those a little bit later too, just to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like. And then we do, for the letters of support, letters of commitment, if it's really, if you might have 15 or 20, sometimes we've had that many, we do set up a tracking sheet separate, just so that we know who my organization's reaching out. Have they agreed to send it? Do we need to nag them to get it back in, or have they just not responded? And that happens too. And then I do keep track of the things that we need to upload. This could be upload or attachments. So you'll see things we've talked about in here, the photos, maps, talked about board of directors. This is specific for this grant. A lot of these aren't required for federal grants, but NIFWF is probably something a lot of you all will probably look at. Some of those grants, these are very common for NIFWF grant requirements. And then I keep track of if I've loaded it in the portal, just so I can check it off that I know it's in there and it's completed. I do usually go over internally with my program lead portal loading sometimes. NIFWF we do, there's some specifics with the metrics and things we like to double check on. So we'll do a portal load check. So everything in there needs to be done. I do that on federal grants myself. I'll come back to my checklist and I'll make sure everything that I say I have my to-do list is uploaded and is the most final version that we have. And we try to do those a couple of days ahead of time. So that's kind of the tour of my organizational and then my to-do list. And I do drive some of my staff crazy and my team members crazy, but it makes life easier and it keeps you on track.
I'm gonna go ahead
Chase,
and
it's all
share-
yours.
Yep, I'm gonna share the screen again. Okay. And we are at our next break. It should be just taking a second to.
Yeah, and Chase, can you put your headphone down?
Yep, I was
Right.
just about to do that. So we are at our next question break. So I was gonna go ahead and open it up for anyone else that had any. They haven't already been putting. I haven't seen any other questions come in, but if there's any other questions related to some of the sections that we just talked about or anything else related to that, wanted to give everyone a chance to do so. And while we're waiting for some of those to come in, I would like to just kind of pose, we got one in here that I wanted to pose to you both. If you could just maybe talk a little bit about this, that there is obviously a certain amount of capacity and other needs surrounding doing a federal grant versus maybe doing other types of grants. So wondering about like what's needed to go into most of those federal grants and how do and about some of how the reporting and other things that the requirements that go into that, like how does that differ maybe from other types of grants, and how would an organization know if they're ready to go after a federal grant? Like what is some of the things that they should be considering when taking on this challenge?
Yeah, I think a lot of the federal grants, usually when you read through the notice of funding or the RFP, request for proposal, it a lot of times now I'm starting to see them talk about reporting. Generally, you're going to need to do, you're going to have to do a progress report. You're going to have to do a financial report. Those are federal, the financial reports. Sometimes those are on specific federal forms. They have directions. Usually a project officer will walk you through those. Depending on the grant source, you might have to do a minority and disadvantaged business report. Like if you subcontract or contract out, you might have to do reporting on that. A lot of times they will, in the RFPs and the funding requests, list the types of reporting that you will have to do. They kind of give you a heads up. It's not insignificant, and you do have to pay attention to it. And we are going to go into, at the end about like reporting and compliance, and then kind of close out on some of those things. And if you have questions about it, I would reach out to the technical lead and say, hey, can you give me an idea? What are the reporting requirements? They're not for the faint of heart. There are requirements, but they're usually they're laid out pretty, I think, in pretty good detail. Sometimes it's almost too much detail. You're like, there's a lot in there. So I think we can speak to that a little bit more later. Carolyn, do you have anything to add there?
Well, I was just kind of saying broadly, like, if you have capacity to write the grant, then you'll probably have the capacity to do the reporting.
Yeah.
But if writing it and pulling all these various pieces together feels overwhelming, then the reporting and the compliance and all that is also going to overwhelm you. So it just depends. And the more complex, like if you're going into a construction grant,
yeah,
that's going to be
a different ball game.
That's a whole different beast. If you're, just doing something that involves like research or, the construction grants are a whole different beast because the laws and regulations around materials and contracting and wages, etc., and reporting and permits, and it's just overwhelming at times, even for people who are professionals at it. So the simpler the grant, the simpler everything else is. But
I also think for this group in particular, the land acquisition, while the reporting might not be as heavy, the implementation can be very tricky because of easements and kind of depending on if you're bringing multiple funding sources together. just to understand up front that if funding source A and funding source B also both require easements on a land acquisition as part of the award, especially if it's state and federal, sometimes there is a push and pull between state and federal and who takes precedent. Not that it can't be worked out, but that just can be like a potential kind of implementation hiccup. I know that's something that we've seen a lot at the Conservancy, of making those easement language requirements work. Same thing on the like historical properties kinds of upgrades. A lot of times local historical if you have a property or project that's had local money, state money, not local, but state money, and has certain specific requirements attached to that money, federal money added to that, sometimes those need to be worked out. Doesn't mean it can't happen. It's just have to be aware of making sure that you're meeting both of those sets of requirements and that people are happy about it. Sometimes they're not, and you can't get to resolution. I think most of the time people want to get to a resolution to allow the project to go forward.
Thank you. We do have one question in here, and I can give Susan access to ask her question live. 1 second.
Oh, somebody else besides the three of us on the screen.
Yes. So let me go ahead. Suzanne, if you want to ask your question that you just posted up there.
Thank you. Yes, we're working with a volunteer staff with the museum committee. We have about 12 to 16 people interested in helping, but only one has grant writing experience. So my two main concerns are with the meeting of the deadlines when it's not their primary job. We have a vast experience pool, but none with grant writing, and they all have very demanding jobs. The other concern is the consistency within the application bundle. What would be your suggestions for working with a volunteer force, and also for like a recommended team size?
Team size, I mean, we often work for the narrative in particular. Like internally, I manage all the pieces of the grant. Like I'm like, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do that. For the narrative, what we'll do is we'll set up that template and then we'll assign individual sections. That might be a really good place where your grant writer could definitely come into play. Maybe you have, section experts in certain areas that can answer, 3 of the questions, but not all the questions. So you ask them to answer 2 or 3 of the questions, especially if they're volunteer and they have limited time. And then maybe you ask that grant writer to go through and do a top to bottom read of all of the responses, to look for, making things cohesive, making sure, language things are similar, kind of like an overall, almost like copy editor, if you would. I know I do a lot of that just to kind of make sure, the first time an acronym's introduced, just all those like little nits that if you don't have like one set of eyes on it, that's been really helpful. And then also looking for duplications, saying the same things 3 different places. Do you have space? Those kinds of things. That grant writer can probably also help with. Section experts are great. They're often not great at putting things in the space that you give them, whether it's word count, character count, overall page count, but a grant writer can kind of look at that and kind of boil it down to fit that kind of need. And I think the managing of deadlines and expectations of having that kickoff call with, if you have 5 people, 5 volunteers working with you, grants due in 8 weeks, say, does anybody, you guys are great, you're my section experts, anybody have any huge either work deadlines or personal deadlines we need to be aware of that we need to work around? Maybe you're not the best fit for this grant because you don't have the availability. Because a lot of times when you want to volunteer, at least I know when I do, I'm like, oh, I'm all in. Then I'm like, oh, I didn't think about this. But if somebody challenges me and has me think about, do I have a big work deadline? Do I have a big personal deadline, vacation or something where I'm going to be offline that would impact my ability to provide my time and brain power to this project? And then maybe setting up the check-in calls. And again, those check-in calls don't have to be long. Sometimes ours are an hour, sometimes they're 15 minutes. If people are doing their work, they're usually 15, 20 minutes. So they're quick check-in calls. Sometimes using that to-do list, I think works really well in that somebody can say, hey, it's complete, or hey, I have I have a question about this. You do need a traffic cop. You need one person kind of managing that process. But I think, you know, with a good to-do list, checking in on their availability, making sure that the load isn't too much for them over the overall grant, that would be a good way to keep them engaged and keep them happy so they come back and use that great brain power that they want to bring, but don't overwhelm them and burn them out either. Carolyn, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, another good way is you could assign volunteers to help pull together some of the collateral materials, you know, like, you know, task them with getting the partner letters or maps and photos, or, you know, if they're a financial whiz, you know, helping you pull the numbers together for the budget. You know, those are good areas that volunteers, it's a targeted assignment and might play to some of their strengths. I'm just trying to think of other ways. Like someone has to be the overall conductor of the whole thing. So that might be you, Suzanne, it sounds like. But yeah, the grant writer can take all the disparate chunks and pull it together into a cohesive form. But there's a lot of extra, you know, like all the forms you're going to need to fill out, you know, chasing all that down, getting those filled out, people can help with. So that's kind of an additional way I would think about using the volunteers. Does that answer, does that help, Suzanne?
Yes, it sure does. Thank you.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so let's see if there's any more questions here. Looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment. That being said, we might wait till give it one more question break before we take our break here, because we're actually moving pretty well through here. So if you want to jump into the next section, and then we will go ahead and we'll take a break after our next section. So but please feel free to drop in questions into the chat, well, into the Q&A, and then you all can also respond on the chat as well, and we'll keep going through here. So let me go ahead to the next slide. All right, should be shifting there now. Yep.
Yep, we see it.
Okay. And this is kind of just reinforcing, you know, the two visuals that Susan pulled up before. As you're going through the application, you're going to want to start creating a share folder. So some people use SharePoint, some Google Docs, some Basecamp, you know, whatever your share area is, and setting up all those folders so that you can download all of the provided templates from the applications into there, into that folder. And so I like to think of it as an area where we create like draft. Here's the templates. Here's our draft versions of letters, or draft versions of narratives, or draft versions of the budget. And then we have our final folders that we're going to use for submission. And then all the collateral and reference materials. So it's kind of like getting you thinking about how you're going to put, you know, 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 people's efforts into one shared area so that you can all contribute at the same time or simultaneously. And it's, you know, the proverbial hit by the bus, everything's in one place.
And I do a lot of files and subfolders, and I know I drive some of my team a little crazy. They have to like dive down, but I've also seen where you have one folder and it's everything in it, and then you don't know what anything is. You don't know if it's a narrative or what draft or what version. I like to keep, because version control, especially if you're not working in like a Google Drive where it's shared and everybody can kind of do their own thing. If you're passing documents around, that like version control, like I like to have a folder, like if I have a narrative folder, and then I have like a little one that'll say old, which means, because I hate to get rid of anything, because you never know when you might need it again. But I have like the live active version we're working on, that's a draft of, you know, whatever the date is. And then when we change that date or it's been updated by somebody, I move it to old, and I have one active. So that way I know that's my latest and greatest. And then whenever something is like finally done and it's ready to upload, I put final on it. You can have a date. A lot of people like to have dates. Dates are great. Mark it final. That way I know it's final. And then if you do get awarded and something changes, you can go back and be like, what was my final that I submitted? And you have a copy of that.
Okay, Chase next.
Okay, should be switching now.
Okay.
Oh, so I get this one, the fun of the required forms. This is going to sound like a lot of
Yeehaw.
alphabet soup. And it is. I will say, as you do more and more grants, you will start to learn what these are. I don't think I mentioned, but my first grant, I was like in my early 20s, and I was a program person working in air quality policy, and my executive director was like, Susan, I got something for you. You're going to help write a grant, or you're going to lead the grant writing, and our accountant's going to help you. And I went to him. He's like, I have no idea what I'm doing. So we read everything by word, and we learned the forms. So there are a lot of numbers. There are a lot of acronyms with this. It does get easier. So some of the federal forms, the 424 is a general application form. Some agencies have general application forms that are named a little different, but there is a form. It's basically what your organization is, who you are, what your time period, your overall budget, key contact people. It really is not overwhelming. I do think grants.gov in particular does a really nice job for all of these forms. You can get the form and you can download directions, and they tell you cell by cell what you should put in it. So they do a really nice job. 424A, we're going to show an example of that a little later. That's the general budget form. So it has like the overall, what's the federal ask, what's the match, handful of like budget categories like salary, fringe, those kind of things. We'll show that a little later. 424B, that's shoot, I forget exactly what it is. The 424B, it's like a sign off form for like non-construction. 424C is another budget form, but that one is for construction. Often there will be a lobbying disclosure form. Somebody already mentioned the lovely logic models. A lot of times those are required. A lot of EPA grants in particular have a contacts list. So like who can sign for the grant, who is the program manager, who is in charge of getting funding. And then the sometimes required types of documents, resumes, bios, for the historical grants, if there's a National Register listing, financials, again, different kinds of audits. If you have a single audit, sometimes you don't. Property owner, letter of consent, a lot of those are for if there's a project that's going to be done on private property, you need to make sure the feds want to know that the property owner is on board with the project.
Okay. Should be switching now.
Yep.
And then some other items, which we've already addressed in other areas, but they may be required, they may be optional. And if they're optional and you have them or can get them fairly easily, I would go ahead and upload them, because that only adds to, that's a good thing. But maps, photos, titles, surveys, permits. One thing I forgot to talk about, which I meant to earlier, was NEPA reviews. That's another acronym. So those are the environmental reviews. If you're working in critical areas or doing things with critical areas, or watersheds in particular, they might need an environmental review to be approved before anything can happen on your project. Some things, if you're working in historic preservation, they might want to have you be on the National Register, so you're going to have to prove that. They might want you on the state register. You know, it just depends. There's a wide variety of things. So just in general, they're going to have specifics on how you want these things formatted. And someone, I think, when we were first getting going, alluded to, wouldn't it be nice if they had standardized requirements across the system? Unfortunately, they don't. So you're going to need to see what formats, what JPEG sizes, what, you know, type of files they're going to allow you to upload, and file and size limits and page limits. And if you haven't checked all this out on the front end and you're going to hit the submit button, it'll kick you out of the system if you don't have these things done properly. So before you put your team to work, make sure you know what you're asking them to pull together. So just kind of
Yeah.
reminder on that. It's
A
pretty
couple of other
basic.
things, just thinking of this, and I should have written it in, but it's not, doesn't happen as much for the federal side, but if you're doing like a state-based grant, sometimes you have to show that you are registered to do business in that state, and there's a registration process. I'm not gonna go into that detail.
Certificate of
but
good
that kind-
standing.
Yeah, that exactly. They might want to see that you're, sometimes it's as simple as that your certificate of good standing in Maryland, and they'll accept that. Sometimes you have to actually be registered to do business in that state to receive state funding. So if you're a nonprofit or an entity that works in multiple states, you might want to look into what those state requirements are. Delaware is a little unique in that you have to have someone with a physical address in Delaware. It can be a staff member, it can be a partner, it can be a volunteer. They have to have what's called a registered agent. That's just a little nuance there. Sometimes those things will creep in. Sometimes for federal grants, they want to see that you have the ability to work. Very few of these tend to be Economic Development Administration. But my Carolyn's favorite grant ever to operate in that state. So you might have to go and get those. A lot of times those documents are available online. You can get them the same day. Sometimes it'll take a couple days, or they'll mail them or they'll mail them to you. Sometimes they won't email them. So that could just kind of build, again, recognizing upfront what you need so that you can knock those types of things out before, 2 or 3 days before the grant's due, and not get caught up on that. I will admit I have driven to pick things up in Delaware and driven back because we had to have them in a certain time period. So
Okay, changing the slide.
Okay, and so this is the review rubric, evaluation criteria. It can be called any number of things, but guidelines, whatever it is, this is something that you want to pay the most attention to on the notice of funding opportunity, or the RFPs or the RFQs. This is the meat of what's going to win you the grant. And so in some questions, they might be asking you for a summary, an abstract, but then they'll pop in language like, and who's going to benefit, and what are the impacts, and what's your target audience? So you may not be thinking about that necessarily for the summary and the abstract of your project. You have to really look at, and I actually do take highlighters in the question to look at, if they've listed out things they want you to include in that question, include it. Even if it doesn't quite fit with the question. They might ask you to describe your project in the same sentence or the same section, talk about your target audience, which sometimes is a separate section. Sometimes they want that in the description. So really I look at it like very analytically, like they ask me for who's benefiting, who's the target audience, what are the impacts, what amount am I asking for? Like, look at the actual words they're using. And then even if it doesn't make sense in your mind as to how you would summarize or describe your project, you need to be sure and include all those things. The other thing I think about when I'm looking at evaluation criteria is if they've listed out 10 criteria, I will list number 1, boom, and I will address that. Number 2, boom, I'll feed it back to them exactly as they presented it in the RFP. Because that makes it easier for the reviewers to map to what they're looking for. For example, one proposal I just worked on, they were asking you to align, talk about how your project aligned with their 3 goals. Boom, goal 1, here's how it aligns. Goal 2, here's how it aligns. Goal 3, here's how it aligns. I'll just spit right back to them what their goals are and how we meet those goals. And the second thing is really pay attention. Like some proposals, one I just finished, one section was weighted 25 points and one was 20 points. that's the bulk of the application. So I'm going to spend a lot more time on those and getting those right. Theoretically, I'll want to get them all right, but if I know that my capacity and time are limited, those are the ones I'm going to pay attention to. And make sure your supporting documents, if you have some optional supporting documents, you know, sending in quotes from partners or pictures or, you know, past work or annual reports, things that kind of tell your picture and paint your story more, I think are really helpful. Like if you have a narrative and you're given like 5,000 characters and that's not nearly enough to talk about your project, fill in the blanks with photos and with quotes and with support letters and things so they get the rounded picture. And then again, not to beat a dead horse here, but you know, if they tell you have 8 pages with 1 inch margin, it has to be 8 pages with 1 inch margin, or it will literally kick out of the system. So pay a lot of attention to those kinds of guidances, really critical.
And
And
even if the page limit, sometimes they'll include a whole bunch of things in a page limit, but they'll only, you know, maybe the resumes are pages 11, 12, and 13, and so that you can actually submit more in your narrative, but your narrative can only be 10 pages, they will stop reviewing. I've had friends who have had federal agencies stop reviewing at page 10, and then they had some other information they wanted that they were supposed to include, but it exceeded that 10 pages. They didn't get any points because it was on pages that were not allowable. So they literally did not review them. They just stop. And I've seen proposals and had folks want to include hyperlinks and URLs and things like that. The reviewers are generally given direction, especially in federal and state grants. Foundational stuff, I think they have a lot more flexibility, but on federal and state grant, that they can only review the information that is presented to them. So they can't follow those links. They can't go look up that information. So really be wary of when you put in those kinds of links that they might not get looked at. You're much better at using it as an attachment if you're allowed. Supplemental, optional information, you know, like Carolyn said, your annual report or, you know, those kinds of things. Or if it's to show qualifications of someone, you know, papers they presented or things like that. You want to make sure anything that you really, really want them to look at is in that portal, has been submitted that way so that they can review it. The other thing to remember with reviewers and kind of rubrics, they are not allowed to bring any information. They're not supposed to. I mean, of course they do. They're human. They're supposed to look at that review, the package you submitted. So don't assume they know you, especially for nationally competed grants. You don't know where your reviewers are coming from. The federal agencies try to do a really good job of bringing in, you know, people that know the subject matter, but they might not necessarily know your geography. They might not know why your parcel that you're trying to preserve and conserve is so important in your area. You got to tell them. You got to beat them in the head. You got to just be really clear about why it's important. They might not, and assume they don't know who you are. This is something I struggle with a lot because we have some funding streams that we go to repeatedly, but I can't assume that group of reviewers this time knows who the Chesapeake Conservancy is and why we have connections to XYZ. So don't make any of those kinds of assumptions. I think that's really hard. I think, Suzanne, you had mentioned earlier, is a way to deploy volunteers. That could be a way you could ask a volunteer to read through and be like, here's the rubric, here's my narrative. Am I answering all the questions? You know, because they have a fresh set of eyes and they're not bringing those kind of built-in assumptions that you will often bring as somebody close to the project.
Next, Chase,
Yep.
thanks.
Yep.
And then continuing on this, the funding opportunities may have a narrative template, may have a budget template, may have other templates, and you have to use theirs if provided. If not, you can use your own, but just make sure they're clean and easy, etc. And so some things to look for is the font size and the margin size and page limits. And like I filled out one recently, submitted one, it was a state grant, and the guidance was it can be maximum 25 pages excluding data. But the data was woven throughout the entire document. There was no separate data section. So it was like, so how do we measure that if, you know, you have 2 paragraphs with data, 2 paragraphs without data? It was very strange guidance. Very strange guidance. So it ended up being 40 pages, but the data was woven throughout. It wasn't cleanly done. And we asked them if that was okay. And they said, yeah, but it was like, this guidance was tricky. So do they want Word, PDFs? How do they want you to enter it into the portal? One thing that can trip us up is length limitations on the sections. So are things page length or character counts? And this trips a lot of people up because, and I actually find it's easier to like write a dummy example in the portal and see what's accepted. Because sometimes they'll say, this section can be 500 characters. And then you put your 500 characters in and it turns out it's 500 characters with spaces. So then you have to shorten everything you've written. So I actually kind of do a test to see what their portal is doing before I go to the trouble of writing everything. And same with word count. Is it word count with spaces or without spaces? You know, this can get really tricky and really trip you up, and you can have to spend, if you're coming down the wire and you have to rewrite every section of your narrative, that gets a little hairy. And then I think we've already talked about, you know, some of these other things just with the deadlines and the team check-ins and having more than one set of eyeballs on things is really a good idea, a very good idea. And, you know, as you're working with your team, you can adjust deadlines as needed. Just make sure you give yourself a little window of opportunity there to give some wiggle room.
And for the due date, the reason I put that in big letters, everybody, you'll remember the day it's due. Make sure you know the time it's due, because of these are all portal, whether you're going through grants.gov or it's a state portal or a foundation portal, often they will say, because they can turn it off a certain time, you know, January 21st, 4 p.m. There's a bunch of grants that are due at 4 p.m. A lot of the federal grants, not all, a lot are due at 11:59 the day. So you do get, you know, an extra few hours. Make sure, and usually those are East Coast time, not that anybody's working out on the West Coast, but you could be on vacation or you could be at a meeting or something. So just be aware of exactly what the timeline is. We don't ever want to be butting up against those deadlines like that of 11:58 for an 11:59 submittal. It does unfortunately happen for whatever reason. I was guilty of pretty late last week. I had a couple hours, but it was the day of in the evening, and I was waiting for a last letter of support to come in, and I told my team, I'll give you till 7 p.m. and then I'm going to submit it. I had everything else, and I was just waiting on that one last letter of support, and it was due at 11:59 that night. So, you know, it does happen, but watch the days are easy to remember, really remember the times. And from federal agency to federal agency, they tend to have their own peculiarities of when they make things due, but I always just double check it. And I probably double check it serially, like, I don't know, once a week. I'm like, okay, what's the date? What's the time? It just, you know, it causes me anxiety. So I always check the date and the time.
Okay, should be switched.
Okay, so this one is me. I'll keep talking. So for the budget, most federal and state grants and a lot of foundations as well, they will provide you a template, which is great. For the federal side, you will be submitting on either like a 424A, a 424C. It's a very specific format. But that can be a little bit different than kind of how you internally would generate your own budget. So I'm going to show kind of how we generate our own internal budgets and then how we translate that to the format that the feds want. Some of the general categories that are included, see them all the time on federal awards or the labor, your salary, your staff time, your fringe, your travel, supplies, meetings, subcontracts, subawards, other, and then of course an indirect rate. Really need to have a good understanding to generate your budget of how your organization handles that indirect. Indirect can be kind of calculated in a bunch of different ways. So get with your financial person, your accountant, your CFO, whoever it is, so you understand how your indirect is set up. If you don't have an indirect rate, which you very well may not, totally fine. Understand how you can apply, if you want to apply for indirect and include it, and then that you can generally put in up to a 10% de minimis rate. And then also working with your accounting person, understanding what that applies to, kind of what the multiplier is. Now this, I could go down into the weeds. It could probably be its own webinar is nonprofit federal budgeting. So I don't want to get down too far in the weeds, but just understand, you need to understand like that negotiated indirect cost rate, what it applies to, and how it impacts your budget when you're developing it. I like to see a budget developed from the bottom up. And what I mean by that is I've written my project, or I have my project envisioned, and it's going to take these 6 tasks. That's going to include some staff time to do it. We're going to need some money for meetings, money for supplies. Maybe we're doing an acquisition. We need money for closing costs for the actual acquisition itself, whatever it is. Those are the things that have to get paid for. And then how much is it going to cost to pay for those things? The hours it'll take from the various staff to do it, the hard costs for, if you include travel, all of those kinds of things. One thing about federal grants in particular, they will want to see what's called a budget narrative. And I used to bang my head against the wall my first couple grants and be like, I'm telling you the numbers. Why do you need it written out? They will want it written out in plain English. So staff time, these 4 staffers are going to be doing XYZ. One's a program manager, one's actually implementing, one's doing outreach. Just very simply, doesn't have to be super lengthy, couple sentences. Fringe, our fringe rate is X. It includes payroll taxes, health insurance, those kinds of things. Supplies usually are going to need to be a little bit more detailed, depending on the project. Travel, they're going to want to see, okay, if you know how many trips you're going to take or why you would need it, it's going to be 5 trips, about 50 miles at the federal reimbursement rate. They're going to want to see those things. If you don't put those in, they will often come back and ask you to provide more detail. And it's fine if they do. And then if you have any envisioned partners for subawardees, you want to include who they are and what they're going to be doing and the amounts. For contractors, you have to be really careful. If you're going to include a contractor, generally in a federal proposal, you have to have run your own procurement process to select that contractor before you write them in. Now you can just write in X amount for contractors to do XYZ work, and then in the budget narrative, let the federal agency know that you will run a procurement that meets federal procurement rules to select that contractor to do that work. That's totally fine. A lot of times that's a lot easier than trying to do them ahead of time. So that bottom up is super important. And then don't forget grants management staff, or cost for reporting. If you don't have a separate group that does your reporting, or compliance and human resources, if you're hiring people, just build those in. So we often always think about the program people running the projects, but it's going to take a little time for reporting. My rule of thumb is I include about 6 to 8 hours for any report I have to do. If it's quarterly report, semi-annual report, just to build that time in. Sometimes it takes a little more, sometimes it takes a little less. Sometimes for me, in my role at the Conservancy, I end up helping with grant amendments and those kinds of things. So that helps pay for some of that work as well. And then if you're hiring staff, then you want to include, some chunk of time for HR to be involved for hiring that staff. Next slide. Ooh, we're going to jump out. Can you give me the power, please? Okay. So let me go back real quick. First thing I'm going to show is kind of a sample of like an internal budget sheet that I would use for generating a budget or helping my team generate a budget. So these are the general categories that you're going to have: this personnel, fringe, travel, equipment. I kind of just talked about those. If we're going to include any kind of match, like to say if it's secured, if it's intended to apply. Sometimes the federal agencies want to see that, sometimes they don't. And then I'd like to know what year those are going to be used in. So that's kind of like the high level budget. Now, the bottom up, where I get that from, and the reason I say bottom up, I've had project program staff before say, oh, it's X percentage of a person, it's X percentage of these 3 people, that's your budget. And I'm like, is that really the amount of hours that it takes to do the tasks that you need to do to make the grant whole, to actually carry out what the work you want to do? That's why I like that bottom up kind of analysis. It's a little more tedious, takes a little more thought, but I think it puts you in a stronger position so that you know the $100,000 you're asking for will actually do the work you want to do and you don't go over budget. So this is what I do. I put together, I look at, you know, these are staff people, like made up staff people and a made up grant. I always like to know kind of the percent of the project hours. That's just something I do. You probably don't need to do. And then these are just a very quick, like, sentence or two or some text about the type of work they would be doing. And I would look at, okay, is it going to be, are those 500 hours? Does that make sense for that person to do that work? Can they do all the things we've said they need to do for that many hours? Yes, no. Sometimes it goes back and forth and we tweak things. And then I get a salary. For us, we have our payroll taxes and fringe, and we have a multiplier of 26%. Every entity kind of does it a little differently. So again, talk to your accountant, talk to your CFO, whoever does your accounting types of things. And then I include travel, if there's any travel, if there's supplies, generally, and this is, I've gone back and forth with folks. You can include equipment. Actually, let me make this bigger. You can include equipment, but equipment generally is above $5,000 for one item. And then you have to get into like depreciation and things like that. So things like computers, a lot of folks would say, oh, that's equipment. In the federal world, if it's below $5,000, it's a supply. So you put it on the supply line. You can put in other things that don't fit. Maybe you have to do like cloud computing services, or you need to, maybe it is for some of the due diligence for land acquisition or something like that, like title survey work, that could go under other, for those kinds of things. And then any kind of contracts or subawards generally go just below that. And then that all rolls up into my overall budget. So on the 424A, and I'm going to show that to you next, you need to provide this level of category. So you need to show personnel fringe, these major categories translate over to that 424. So that's why I talk about that bottom up, rolling up into a personnel number, a fringe number, etc. The 424A, they will ask for how much is going to be used the first year and how much is going to be used the years after, and then a quarterly breakdown. The only time that I provide, generally when I provide that quarterly breakdown for that first year detail, I just do it by 4, unless I know there's going to be some huge expenditure in Q2 or Q3 or whatever it is, just because it generally is easier for assuming the flow of work will be about even. And I've even asked a number of my federal partners, I'm like, do you want me to try to, and they're like, no, that's usually generally good unless you know there's some big jumps. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and then I'm going to share the 424A. Give me 1 second to switch over to that.
And just while she's looking, we were talking earlier together and saying, you know, get all the kinks out of your own internal budget first before you shift it over to this. Makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. Yeah. And things like reviewers, we had having a clean review of your grant materials. So you want to make sure your budget numbers are the same everywhere. And I've had program people and I love them, and they'll change something and then I have to go in like 6 different places and change the budget. Sometimes I will even just in those places until I know it's 100% done, I will highlight things, or I just won't put anything in, because then I don't have to worry about, oh, did I change it in 3 places and not the other 3 places, that type of thing. It just makes it a little easier. So yeah, try to have all those budget things worked out before you start filling out any of the federal forms. It just makes your life easier. You can totally change them, just makes it easier so you don't forget things. If there's a mismatch, they're not going to not give you the money, but they're going to ask you why, and they're going to make you make everything match. So, and it's just, to me, I think it just shows a more professional look when everything aligns correctly. So this is, I just pulled a grant program function or activity. The CFDA number, this catalog of federal domestic assistance, that number is on every, should be in every NOFO and every RFP. And the other thing is if you ever do any kind of pass-through awarding, it should be on that award agreement itself too. Entities need to track, nonprofit partners need to track for auditing purposes those CFDA numbers. So it's always nice to put that, it's just good practice to put that on any sub-award agreement. But you can find that number either in grants.gov, on the RFP. So it's around and it's out there. As I had mentioned before, grants.gov does have a nice set of directions for filling out the 424A, and they talk about, section A, exactly what they want, where they want it put. So you don't have to write down all these notes. And I think the directions are fairly straightforward. So this is an application. So we're asking for this for this sample grant, 105,000 plus change. And then we have a match of 75K. I've had a couple of different agencies. Oh, and they even do the pop-ups. I forgot. It'll give you directions if you hover of like what they want included, which is kind of nice. I've had federal partners tell me 2 different ways to do this, where match is included in this first line, where it would go under the non-federal here, or where it's called out. I think it's much easier, and you'll see why on the next page, to have it in 2 separate lines. And it's much easier to kind of track internally for me when I'm doing financial reporting on my grants. So I put this 75,000 for my sample project here. And then these auto calculate, which is really, really nice. They used to not do that. Used to have to fill them out by hand and then worry if things got messed up, but they do auto calculate. So I always double check that these numbers at the bottom, if you have multiple numbers, total your total program cost from your spreadsheet. And then we go to page 2, because no federal form is 1 page. And you'll see where those first columns, this is the federal money, and then this is the match. If you do it all in one, then you have to offline put the match for your personnel and for your federal funding together and then track it. It's a total pain. If they'll let you do it this way and won't complain, I would totally do it this way. It just makes it so much easier to track. So you'll see the personnel, the fringe, the travel. These are the categories that rolled up into my sample budget. And then I've just translated them over here. And it auto calculates, which is great. For this one, just because I was making it easy, we're going to bring $75,000 versus contractual. And then these total over here by budget category. And then again, you have the 180,803. And that's that's the total. Some things that can pop in. If there's any kind of program income, we really try to stay away from any kind of program income or that just can be a total nightmare. It's hard for the accountants. It has to be managed separately. You have to like deal with taxes and stuff on it. Like that is a world I try to stay away from. And I know at the Conservancy, we try to stay away from any kind of program income that we anticipate from a grant. And then page 3, this just talks about, again, the non-federal sources. So this first line, that's federal. So you don't have to say anything there. The match and where the match is coming from. If you have, partners are bringing in other match besides you, then you would put it in this section. And then on the sample, we talked about the first year forecasted cash needs for the federal. So for the federal, I just did it in 2, and then I do it quarterly, all the same. And then non-federal, I just was like, oh, okay, this example project, quarter 2, we're going to spend $50,000. And then the rest of the money is going to be used in future funding periods in future years. Sometimes you'll have multi-year grants. This one, for my example, was just 2 years. This other budget information, I generally put what our indirect charge rate is. And for us at the Conservancy, our indirect just goes on salary. Other organizations do it different ways. So that's why I had mentioned before, you need to get with your accountant and kind of understand if you have an indirect rate that you're going to use. That's how you would apply it. So I'm going to stop sharing. That's a lot of numbers. That's a lot. Like I was trying to hit the right level to show some examples. As I mentioned, grants.gov, the directions, I think they do a really nice job of the directions. You could see where there were some pop-ups to kind of remind you of what's included, what's not included. And if you have questions, reach out. Usually grants will have a technical lead for the programmatic side, and then they will have a grants lead that you can reach out and ask questions to. And they're usually really happy to answer those questions and guide you in the right direction. And as I said, I've had different federal agencies tell me different ways to fill things out. So I just, whatever grant they want it done that way, I'm like, okay, I'll do it that way. Whatever makes them happy.
All right. Well, thank you. We're gonna move into our next question break here, and I'm gonna give we had a couple questions from Karen here, so I'm gonna go ahead and allow Karen to ask the question. So, Karen, if you're there, if you would like to ask your question live, or I can read it.
Oh, let's see. I can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What's the difference between contractual and subaward?
That is a great question. So generally a subaward is to an entity that you are working in partnership with, and they have some control over the type of project and exactly how it's implemented. And this is really general because we actually have a guidance internal to Conservancy that we use. Okay, is it a contract? Is it a subaward? A contract, generally, you're going to be very specific. We want Joe's Contracting to build 4 fences and dig 2 ditches versus we want Jane's nonprofit to do outreach to accomplish X goal. Like usually a subawardee has much more discretion on the work that's being done versus a contract. Now, in the federal world, even if you, the other thing with subawards is when you have a subaward agreement, like the agreement vehicle to move that money to that subawardee, you flow through all of the federal requirements that you have to abide by as an awardee, as a prime awardee, all flow to that subawardee. If it's a contract, some things will flow through and some things won't. To get around that, people will often say, oh, well, we're just going to call that contract, that subaward a contract, or vice versa, whatever makes it easier. You can't do that. If you get audited and they come in and they look at that agreement vehicle, whether it's a subcontractor or a contract or a subaward, they will look at the nature of the work and the relationship to determine what should have flowed through, what requirements and reporting or whatever should have flowed through. So you have to be really, really super careful with that. I can dig up, Chase, I can make a note and dig up kind of how we determine that and try to provide some references of places to look for the difference between a subaward and a contract. There's some very specific federal guidance in the Code of Federal Regulations for that. And I can look that up to share. And it's something we often go back to and just read through and try to think about. You will not often see subawards to a for-profit entity. I will say that. But it's not like, that's not always hard and fast, but like, that's just one of those. But you can have a contract with a nonprofit. So it really is the nature of the work. But I can look up some of that and try to provide it as some resources because it's a tricky area.
Thank you. One clarifying thing, when you said the requirements flow through and you mentioned reporting. So the subaward would do the same kinds of reports that the primary one would do, but the contractor doesn't have to do reports. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes and no. So the subawardee will report to the prime because you need to be able to report on the work that they've done. The prime awardee always retains the responsibility for the output and the outcomes of the work and the fiduciary, the financial responsibility. So you still need to make sure that the work's being done, is following federal procurement rules and regulations. If there are any, sometimes there are requirements on using best I forget, was it the 6 best, whatever, for like dealing or using minority and like women-owned businesses. A lot of times those requirements flow through. And you might ask a subawardee for reports up so that you can roll up to your reporting responsibility. But the requirements that flow to a prime awardee generally will flow through to a subawardee. Sometimes that can be, and I've seen where a prime awardee will just say, here, we tack it all on, go. And that can be really overwhelming. A lot of times a subawardee is a smaller entity. So we at the Conservancy, we try to like call out like we do flow everything through, but we try to call out the things that might be confusing or be different, or we think could be a stumbling area for that subawardee, because we want them to be successful and their reporting to be in good shape, so that our reporting's in good shape. I think that's just good practice.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I have a few other questions if that's okay.
I don't think we have anyone else putting in questions yet, so feel free. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I guess I have some questions about the guidelines for procurement, and it's my understanding you either have to get 3 bids or publicly advertise it. But what if you already have a contractor you usually use? Do you still have to get other bids? And I've heard talk of you could have an on-call or on-demand or something contract. What's the
Yeah, there's a
procurement
lot.
regulation for that? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have you really want to have your own internal procurement policy. You want to make sure that that policy is consistent with the federal sources or state sources of funding that you're going after. Generally, that means that anything above like $3,000 has to have like 3 quotes kind of thing. But
Uh-huh.
what level those 3 quotes are, is that just like I have 3, I asked 3 people to give me quotes versus putting a bid out in the, sending out an RFP and posting it and having it be open for 30 days. Like you can have different tiers of what you require based on different levels of funding. I have seen where entities and states actually do this a lot for procurement, where they'll put out like one big, okay, we have this amount of work we need to get done. And you basically run a procurement process, and then you develop what's called a preferred list of vendors, and they've already basically gone through your procurement process.
Oh.
So that can be done if you have a lot of similar kinds of work, but you don't want to have just one vendor. You want to have 2 or 3 vendors on that list that you can call upon. And then your last point was, sorry, your last question.
It was something about an on-demand or on-call contract.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like having that preferred list of
Okay.
vendors that you can pull from, because they've already gone through like an open procurement process that you can pick from them. That's something that we're looking at doing internally for some of our implementation work, but we still want to rank, that we would have, like if we have, and I've seen it in other organizations where you'll have, say, 4 vendors that have already run through your procurement process. They can all do basically the same work. But you would have them in rank order, and you might approach them because they might, like their work is cyclical, so they might be busy, and then you don't want to have to do another procurement for the number 2 vendor. So you would kind of have them ranked. You might want to do that annually or every like 2 years or whatever, what makes sense on the cycle and size and scope.
Okay.
I've seen that kind of done before.
Thank you. That's a wonderful idea.
I think we might have to stop there for our questions for this section.
Okay.
But definitely if you have any more questions, Karen, or anyone else, please feel to drop it in the Q&A. What we're gonna do is take a 5-minute break, because just to give everyone just a chance to decompress everything else and get ready for the last section that we have here, and then we'll open up for final Q&A section at the end. So if everyone can be back at 2:02, and I'm going to pause the recording for us, and we'll resume at 2:02. Okay, And we have one other question that we'll wait till the end here, but it was merely about providing some links and sources for additional information regarding contractual versus subaward. So if that's something we can keep in mind for resources we can deliver after, which I think would be possible. But let me go ahead and
And Chase, I do see one additional question about landowner cost.
oh yes,
Counting as a
please.
match. Sorry. Yeah, in the request for proposals or notice of funding opportunity, it will tend to line out usually what types of costs are eligible for match. I would imagine a landowner cost if you're buying purchasing land or doing something on their land and they have contributing land or an easement or whatever, that theoretically would be a great match, but you have to look at each individual RFP.
Yeah, and I don't think that would be program income. The place I've seen program income, and this is like, previous life, was where we were doing pollution reductions for like big diesel equipment. And part of the requirement was you had to scrap the old vehicle, so like the old truck. And when you scrap the truck, you get $500 from the scrapyard. That's program income. And we had, when we started this program, we worked with EPA and we said, okay, we know they're going to get 500, 750, whatever it is. They allowed that money to go toward the cost of the new vehicle, of the replacement vehicle, because the grant funding only paid like 50%, and then the vehicle owner paid the rest. But that scrap income from getting rid of that old truck, taking it out of the fleet, that was program income and was allowed to go back toward the purchase of the new vehicle. But we had to track that. That's like I'm trying to think of a place where that would happen in conservation, and I can't. That's the only place in 30 years I've had program income.
Yeah, I can't think of any.
All right, I'm going to go ahead then and switch to our next slide.
Cool. Okay, so you're back to me. Okay, so letters of support, letters of commitment. We do make a lot of people use these interchangeably, and they're very similar. A letter of support is just a letter from a partner that says, yeah, we think, hey, XYZ agency, we think this is a great project. Please fund it. It's going to, do great things. Good job. A letter of commitment is when that partner would say the same things, but they would say, hey, we're going to bring X amount of dollars of match, or we're going to participate in these 4 ways. So they're an active participant in the project, not just saying, hey, it's a great project. Some grants will allow for either. Some grants will limit the number of both. Some don't want letters of support, just general letters of support. So if you have a partner who thinks it's a great project and they're not allowed to have a letter of support, say, hey, would you be willing to read through this final document, or just find some way to engage them so that it's a commitment of either their in-kind time or any kind of financial resources they would bring. So that's just a little bit of a nuance between the letter of support and letter of commitment. We do, as we mentioned earlier, set up a template that we send out to potential partners for both of those. Sometimes they use them, sometimes they don't. If they give me a whole different letter, I'm not going to say, oh, it's got to be XYZ. It's just to help them out. I think it's just being a good partner, a good courtesy. As part of the kickoff call, I do like to get out in front of those letters of support and commitment, because again, as Carolyn said earlier, it takes time for those entities to work those through. Some take longer than others to get signatures from an executive director or a board member or whatever they have to have. So we like to have develop a list of potential entities. It also helps us identify if we have a match requirement within the grant, of where that match might come from, who can we depend on. And then we designate who's going to be the lead for each individual letter of outreach or letter of support, letter of commitment. I think using volunteers to do some of that, if you have that ability, would be great, especially if they have natural connections with those entities. And if it's more than just a handful, like 2 or 3 letters of support, letters of commitment, I do set up a tracking sheet and then kind of check in on progress, just so it doesn't get lost. If there's multiple letters, especially to government entities or elected officials, those take the longest amount of time to get secured, because there has to be a lot of sign off. And then sometimes calling in almost your, like, calling in favors to get those done. You need to weigh if you want to really use, you don't want to constantly ask the same groups for letters of support and commitment. Because it can be tiring on them. So we try to kind of spread that around a little bit if we can. And as I said, we assign leads. Depending on the complexity and the number, we kind of do weekly or bi-weekly check-ins. Sometimes they'll say, hey, we can't give it to you right now. And that's okay. Sometimes they'll say, yeah, I'll get it to you. And then you just need to remind them to get it in and always tell them the deadline. And usually, if the deadline's the 21st is the grant, give it to them a day. You want that. It's totally reasonable to ask for it a day or two ahead of time. Just because of all the issues that can go wrong or all the other things that you can need to be nailing down that last day if you have to be working on a grant the last day that it's due. Constantly adjust deadlines as needed and review the letters as they come in. Especially if match is included, you want to make sure that they're comfortable with the match, you're comfortable with the match that they've included, that something, they didn't cut and paste something incorrectly, like little things like that happen. It's not a big deal, but you want to catch them before you submit it into a grant. And I always keep my final letters in a separate file. So I know once that letter comes in and I file them immediately. And one of the things, I'm not great at pulling documents out of my email. This is one of the things, the minute it comes in, I drop it in my submission file that I know it's good to go. And I check it off that we have it, just so we know that we're good to go. And as I mentioned before, sometimes they're required, sometimes they're not. Even if they're not required, if there's a place where you can have an optional document attached, I would get a letter of support or letter of commitment. Because especially in the federal sphere, somewhat in the state, but especially the federal sphere, they like to see that there's local support. They don't want to come in as a federal agency and bring money and have a project, everybody excited, and then find out the local county or local entities or other nonprofits or stakeholders are like, why are you doing this project? We don't support it. So that really helps them know that you've done your due diligence. You have good support for the project from the community where it's taking place. So it's really important to have those as long as they're allowed. Sometimes they do only allow like 3. And then you have to be kind of strategic of who you ask. If it's a really small number, like 3, I usually try to do, a good local connection, like nonprofit, a local municipality, if it's a township or if it's a county, it's a county level or a city. And then if I can get, if it's depending on the type of grant, maybe a state agency that's kind of in that sphere as well, if I'm only limited to 3. I haven't seen many of those, but they do crop up. So do check if there are any limitations on those letters. And then Chase, can I have the control so I can switch to our sample?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So this is, so sometimes they want the letter sent, addressed, not sent, addressed to a specific contact in the RFP or the NOFO. Sometimes they can just come directly, be addressed directly to your executive director. So this is just, a template that we did. This is actually for that National Fish and Wildlife Federation INSR grant. This is the sample, and you'll see it's right out of my file, so you'll see some of our gibberish. But you always want to name, who the entity is that's supporting it, what the grant is, if it's a specific grant number, if it's a federal grant, EPA, blah, 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 number, and then the name of the program, the grant program that it is part of, and then the name of your grant or your project that you're putting in there. I generally like to put something in about the connection between my organization and the partner organization, how we've worked together, specifically on something similar or in the realm of this type of grant, why it's been, a positive for the community, how it's moved things forward. Maybe you've done implementation of best management practices, which is what this one's related to. Maybe it's been, you've been partners on land acquisition. It could be anything, but it just shows there's a connection. And generally that kind of is not hard for a program person to kind of put some stuff in. I often see the partner will then go ahead and kind of finagle that and edit that, which is great. I want them to make it their own. I always like to offer the opportunity for the partner to put a paragraph in about what they do, what makes them special, who they are. Because if those reviewers don't know, this is a way of making that connection for those reviewers. And then if there is a direct commitment or a partnership or a match component, usually I put that in that last paragraph and ask them to explain what they're going to do, if there's a hard cash match, if it's in kind, any of those kinds of things. And then as we do that final budget and match, make sure that the match in the letter matches what's in your budget tracking. Okay.
Okay, let me just share that. Okay.
Carolyn, over to you. Yay.
Okay, and these next couple slides are just kind of, we've thrown a lot at you today, so
sorry.
these are just kind of reminders. With all these attachments, set up your tracking sheet, set up the templates, assign the leads to get them. Some examples of things we didn't talk about were, top funders of the past year or 2 or 3, your board of directors, your board resolutions, your procurement policies, your EEO policies, there might be any number of things. And really, you probably already have a folder, but if you don't, it's good to have just a general folder for all grants where you start dropping in these general types of forms that whether it's a foundation, state agency, or federal agency, they might all kind of overlap with wanting the same thing. So if you have them in one main folder, I found it easier. And again, just to recap, you've got your draft documents and then your final documents to be uploaded. So if you want to just skip to the next one, Chase.
Mhm.
And then submission. I'm going to laugh at this one because in a perfect world, you would be setting up, let's say their due date is March 29th. Theoretically, if you made your due date March 27th, that gives you an automatic window for emergencies, etc. But really, your goal really should be to submit 2 to 3 days before things are due, and not wait till that last day because so many things go wrong. The best story I ever had from the foundation, Park Foundation, was Yosemite. Somebody from Yosemite was applying and they got hit with a storm and the power went out the day the application was due. And the person literally had to drive 5 hours away to a Starbucks to try and finish submitting the application. And, we had a little more wiggle room of personal relationships, so we could fudge with the portal if we needed to let them submit. Feds don't do that. They don't care what your excuse is. They just don't. It's an automatic thing. You're shut off if you're not in there, and it doesn't matter. So just best practices, just always think 2 to 3 days ahead as your drop dead date, and that gives you the wiggle room you need. And there's just so many things that can go wrong, like internet access, AT&T's phones all go down, portal is slammed, you have 1,000 people applying at the last minute and the portal freezes. Your documents are not in the right format and you have to redo them all. You've got too many pages or your character count is wrong. There's just so many things that can go wrong. So just give yourself that 2 or 3 days. And I don't need to belabor that point anymore, but just, it's really important. I've seen a lot of upset over the years of people who've spent months working on something and then were, knocked out at the last minute, and it's really heartbreaking. Next one, Chase, please. And then Susan, I'm going to toss it back to you.
Yep. So award acceptance. These are going to be like higher level, kind of going over some key points the next couple of slides, because kind of the award acceptance and kind of forward could be its own set of kind of slides and kind of webinar points to dive into. But we wanted to kind of do like the full life cycle, if you would. So when you get it, it's great. Review all the documents in detail. And this is what, if you get the award. If you don't get the award, automatically ask for a debrief. Sometimes they'll offer that up front. And you want to say, yes, we accept it. Generally, they will offer a debrief, and you need to let them know within 2 weeks of that notification. So there's a clock on it. It's always good. You always learn something. It might not be the great insights that you want, but you will always learn something. And generally, it is the program lead, the technical lead that was on the RFP or the NOFO. So it helps build a relationship with them, and they get to know you. You get to know them a little bit. So if you get that opportunity, it's always wonderful. It's not always possible, unfortunately. So hopefully on the good side, you get the award acceptance, you get an email, and they said, congratulations, blah, blah, blah. Some things you want to do is to review all those documents, whatever they send you in detail. You want to make sure that your deliverables are accurately represented, and that your budget numbers are correct. They're human. Things sometimes drop off or get changed or tweaked, and you just want to make sure that either you call attention to that, or that you're aware that things have gotten tweaked or changed. Especially if you get a partial award. That is not unusual. You put in for $500,000, they're like, great, we love you. We only have $300,000. Can you still do your work? They understand you're going to have to reduce your deliverables, and because it's a reduced budget. So you want to work through all of those issues. Generally, there will be a back and forth if there's a reduction in the award from what you asked. Some key things to look at, again, make sure your deliverables reflect the budget, and that your new budget, you can do what they're asking you to do. Sometimes there is some negotiation there. And if there's any match, make sure that that match is reduced appropriately as well. I've seen one instance where it was a couple $100,000, like a $200,000, $300,000 grant with one-to-one match. The award was only $100,000, and the match wasn't reduced at the same rate. So they were on the hook for that full match, even though they only got a third of the original proposal request. So just look for those kinds of things and make sure that those numbers are reduced and everything is correct. When you get the award documents, we had the question right up front about reporting and compliance. All of those directions are in there. That award acceptance package really becomes your manual for what they're looking for, what's required, what you've committed to, what the timelines are. If you want to change deliverables or budgets, or you need adjustments, all of that is in that document. And I would almost say read that more carefully than even than the RFP. And again, I go through whenever I get an award agreement, I double check and make sure the time periods are correct, the award amount's correct, all of those big things. And then I go through and I highlight all the reporting requirements, whether they're just programmatic, or if they're financial, or if there are other federal requirements that are included. And then any timelines for when those things are due. So sometimes you report on a different timeline than when you invoice. Sometimes you can just draw fines down. And sometimes you have to provide documentation before you can get reimbursement. And just understand what those requirements are, what documentation, and it will be in that award package. What items do they need for you to get paid? That's really important to understand. You're going to need to secure signatures as needed, and then you need to keep a file of the documents. I have a grant file. Carolyn mentioned it earlier. You have a grant file that should contain absolutely everything that you need that's related to that grant. So the proposals, the award agreement, and the implementation should all be in one file. If you're ever audited, those things all go together, and you want to be able to access any of those documents as needed. So keep them in one safe place. And then make sure to set up payment systems. There's a thing called ASAP. I'd have to look that up. What it is it's a system that allows you to go in and draw funds down. So you say, okay, last quarter I spent $100,000. I'm going to go draw down. It's really convenient, but it has to be set up on your side as well as on the awarding agency side. And it's just easier to do up front when you get the award, and have that ready so that when you're ready to draw funds down, you can draw them down as you need them. Most federal awards are reimbursable, meaning you expend the funds or you do the work and then you get reimbursed for it. Many of them will have opportunities where if you need to have funding up front for whatever reason, but then they usually ask for that to be spent within, a couple week window. That can become a bit of a nightmare financially because any interest earned on forwarded funds, you have to keep track of. So just kind of keep that in mind. Sometimes it's not worth the harassment of that. The Federal Form 270, that is a reimbursement form that some grants require you to fill out and provide some additional documentation and then send in to get paid. So it really depends on the grant, if it's a drawdown system or if you have to basically provide an invoice and request funding. So it really depends. And that'll be spelled out in that award package.
Okay, I'm gonna,
Oh, I was going to show an online agreement.
yep. So let me go
Okay.
ahead and give you access to that.
Let's see, okay. It's going to take me 1 second, Chase. I'm sorry. I had
No worries.
I closed. I was like, why do I have that open? And I closed it. So I'll just open one up.
And just while she's looking, just to reiterate, the grant agreement will spell out what payment system you're going to use.
Yeah.
And there will be instructions on how you get set up in that system. So don't worry about doing all that right now.
Sorry. I wanted to make sure I had a federal one for you guys to take a look at. There we go. Okay, you can give, do I have the sharing
Mhm.
power?
Yes, you do.
Okie doke. Okay, so this one is from the Bureau of Land Management, or no, not BLM, sorry. This is a USGS cooperative agreement. Sometimes it'll be a grant agreement, sometimes it'll be a cooperative agreement. This one just happens to be a cooperative agreement. Generally, this is what the notice of award kind of first page will look like. I had mentioned the CFDA number above previously in the presentation. This has that CFDA number. It will be on the agreement. It has to be. That's how the federal government tracks where money goes, is that CFDA number. It'll say the agreement type. This grant number, that's going to be very important. Whenever you communicate to your program officer, because they're managing a ton of grants, make sure you include that grant number. Say, whatever your question is regarding grant number, blah, 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 blah. Just really helps them keep them straight. The project period, the budget period, sometimes these two are different. Generally, they're the same, but sometimes they are different. It'll have information about your title, key personnel. I'm scroll down. Sometimes this is of importance. This is just the source of federal funding of where the money's coming from. Sometimes the feds want you to spend down from like top to bottom. You can check on that if they don't tell you. And then this is just, I don't want to scroll too fast. It will get into, this is the actual agreement offer and all of the text. And then generally in these various sections, it'll talk about funding, award periods. It'll start talking about all the terms and conditions. Generally, there is literally a section that says terms and conditions. Some agencies will incorporate by reference different requirements. It'll say it won't have the entire rule or reference section of multiple pages included in the document. This one probably doesn't because it's only 21 pages. But if it says, incorporated by reference, or it cites, you have to follow CFR, blah, 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 or Davis-Bacon Act, or whatever it is, you're on the hook for that. Whether you have that full text in this agreement or not, if it references it, you need to follow the trail and check it out and make sure you understand what the requirements are. And then there should be somewhere, and I can't remember if this one has it at the end or if your actual proposal should be an attachment, because then you know exactly what you're on the hook for because it's incorporated into the agreement. So I don't want to, talks about deliverables, progress reports, pre-agreement costs. Generally, until you get an inked agreement, even if they say, hey, you've been awarded, generally they'll say, don't start work because you can't pre-award costs until it's inked, till the agreement's actually live. You can't start charging. Sometimes they will allow you to, sometimes you can negotiate that. Even if they say, the Fed say, yes, 3 months prior, because when we awarded it, we know you started working, you can start at your own risk. But if for some reason that agreement doesn't get signed, they're not going to pay. So you're putting your organization at risk. Generally, agreements get inked. Sometimes they don't. I think I can only think of one grant that I worked on that had that happen, and it was out of my control to make sure that it got inked, and it just for whatever reason didn't. So again, you just read through all of these. Like I said, it's 21 pages, just like the RFPs or the NOFOs. Get out your yellow, your marker, mark it up for all important things. And anytime you have a question about what's required or what's due or what are you on the hook for, this is the document you go back to. I get asked, in addition to doing all of our federal development and state public, helping with proposals, I do all of our compliance and reporting, and folks will have various questions about a grant. I'm like, oh, let me go look it up. And even though I generally kind of have an idea of the answer to their question, I always go and double check in the agreement. Just because there can be small nuances from agency to agency, or from different requirements have changed from when one agreement was inked, and 5 years later the rules are a little different, and you might have two separate sets of requirements that you're dealing with. So it's really important just to always reference back to that original agreement. So I'm going to stop sharing. It's back to you, Chase.
Okay, should be back on here. It's just taking a second to change. There we go.
Okay. So you've got your award, it's all signed, and now you're going to implement. Woot, woot, yay. So
I will just so you know, I literally do that when I get that award notice. There's much
like,
celebration.
Yay, we did it. Yay.
Yep.
It's worth celebrating, believe me.
100%.
The bottom line of this slide is talk to your program officer. The first thing you should do, talk to your program officer and just kind of review everything, ask your questions. How do we move forward? You know, what do I need to know to hit the ground running, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, changes, of course, through the course of a project, things change, budgets change. They perfectly aware of that, but just make sure before you do anything, you reach out again to your PO. Anytime you're going to change the trajectory of your project, you're going to change a budget item. It just needs to be, sometimes you just need an email documentation of these changes. Sometimes you need to fill out a form. So it's not like you can just willy-nilly change things. They're perfectly comfortable with it. Usually it does have to be documented. So that's just the bottom line of this slide. I know we're kind of getting pressed for time, so I want to keep us moving fast, and just make sure you meet all your reporting deadlines. Just make sure. That's going to trigger a lot of things if you don't. So we can hit the next slide if you want, Chase.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So compliance and reporting, super important. As I said before, read all the grant agreements, documents, and attachments carefully. That is your manual for what you're on the hook for meeting all the compliance and reporting elements of a given agreement. Follow any of the reference requirements, as I said before. Make sure you understand what you're signing up for. Generally, they're not hard. It's a lot of checking the box and making sure a certain form is in, or that you submitted something or filled something out online. Really, things generally aren't difficult. It's just getting them completed. As I said before, the requirements flow down to your subcontractors and to your subawardees in different ways. So you just need to be aware of that and make sure that you're calling that out to them, and that those things are named in the agreements that you have with them. If you don't understand anything, ask your PO, your project officer, for help. There often is a contract person specialist that they work with that can help you as well. But definitely start with that project officer, and meet your reporting deadlines. As you get awards and then you go for future awards, the feds often ask for how you've performed on past awards. The first time out of the gate, when you don't have a history, you get like a neutral score. Usually it's only like 5 points, but you get like 2.5 out of 5, or 5 out of 10. Moving forward, they will look at that. They will look at your record for submitting reports and for completing things. If you need an extension, ask for an extension. Extensions are fine to get, but you just don't, as Carolyn said, don't just miss a deadline. It's a process. It's not hard, but it's a process, and just make sure you meet it. And then Chase, you want to go to the next one?
Yep. It should be changing. There we go.
Sure. So for closeout, depending on the grant length, you want to talk to your PO, 3 months out, 6 months out. If it's a multi, like 3 or 4 year grant, 6 months out. If it's a year grant, 3 months out, kind of that last quarter. Make sure that you're on track to finish our deliverables, make sure you're on track to finish any of, to spend your funding down. The minute your agreement ends, like if it's, the 31st of the month, the next first of the next month, you cannot bill to that grant. It's closed. And then take note of how long you need to retain your program files after closeout. Usually it's like 5 to 7 years for federal awards, kind of depends, but that means all of the deliverables, all of the financial documents, all that stuff needs to be saved and available should there be any kind of audit for that period of time. And I think that's it.
That's it.
So that's my contact information and Carolyn's contact information. When we went through this, I was like, I don't want to scare people. It's a lot. It is a lot. A lot of it's just process. A lot of it's just reading, being meticulous, kind of gut checking too, to make sure, does this grant really fit what we want to do? I am probably the absolute worst of, we can spin it, we can make it work. So if you're that temperament, you might need a counterpoint to be like, really, does this make sense? Should we go after this? Is it the highest and best use of our time to go after this grant? Those kinds of things. So those are all a good point. So I'll just stop there.
I wanted to just take one moment before we took last questions and just thank Carolyn and Susan for all of their, for this time and for going through all this information and for making this available for everyone here. But I do want to open it one last time. We have some more time here for some questions. So I think there was another one there's 1 or 2 that got added in here. I'm gonna invite Karen Atwood on here. So give me just 1 second for me to do that. Karen, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question that you had dropped in the chat.
Hi, I'm totally new to all of this. And I need to find exactly what I said in the chat or what I asked.
Sure.
I think it was about, if you're applying for any kind of grant, is it important or necessary to have these registrations, this DUNS and SAM and whatever else .gov?
So for regular family foundations, private foundations, corporate foundations, the DUNS registration is a good idea.
Okay.
So generally they'll want your EIN or your federal, identification number, and will often want a DUNS number as well. And foundations tend to want traditional things like, your list of board, what their titles are and what they do, and your financial audits for the past year or two, maybe even some of your donors, if you have policies around, procurement or equal opportunity or, your board policy kind of things, or things to think about for foundations. So that you still need some standard documents, but they're way less onerous than you'll need for the government grants.
Okay, thank you. And let me explain, I'm not part of the finance committee with this group. I was the person available to listen to the webinar. We're interested in building a team to apply for grants and things. We, as with any entity really, but National Wildlife Refuges, we have many, many projects that the Friends Group would like to go after in support of the refuge. And our immediate board, we have apparently worked with some family foundations, but not gone after grants as far as I know. So anyway, I was the one who ended up with the short straw, and I'm trying desperately to understand as much as I can. So thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you for your patience and
Oh, thank you
attending.
all. This has been quite the introduction to things. Thank you.
And I will say something I've noticed between foundations and like we have an institutional director who does like our foundation work. So I don't really dabble in that as much anymore. But foundations tend to ask more generalized questions and they kind of want you to tell them a story about what you're going to do versus the federal stuff and the state stuff since our RFPs are much more question oriented, like you're answering prompts. So it's a little bit, that's kind of a little bit of a nuance between kind of the foundational world and the public world as far as, the way they request information.
Okay.
Or
thanks.
sometimes foundations, I'm just in the middle of a foundation proposal right now where, they have themes and agendas and things they're trying to accomplish in the world. And they want you to talk about how your project helps advance their mission as well as yours. So
Yep.
where's the synergy and the win-win there?
Yeah.
So they'll look for that a lot.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, we had another question from Karen Stupisky, so I'm going to go ahead and bring her back on as well.
Oh, hi.
Hello, feel free to go ahead and ask your question live.
Okay. I had a couple, but I'll just ask one
Go.
about
Feel
in
free.
terms of budgeting for a multi-year grant,
Mhm.
would you build in increases for inflation or cost of living?
100%.
Okay.
100%. You absolutely want to do that. Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
And also, I forgot to mention in that section, like if you have to buy equipment, or, procure things for your staff to get going, obviously that, front loads year one a little bit. Like
Okay.
if you have to buy the minivan to transport the kids to the education camp, that has to go in year one, or all your computers, that has to go in year one.
Yeah.
So, I forgot to mention that when we were
Okay.
talking about budgeting.
And then I had a quick follow-up on the program income.
Mhm.
I was wondering if you give a workshop, for example, a workshop on conservation easements, and you charge a tuition for it, would that count as program income?
I think if it goes over the cost of what if the tuition exceeds the cost of putting on the program, then that would probably be a good example of program income. So if it costs you $300 per student and you charge $5, that difference is program income.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
And I would ask your lead on the RFP if that can be used as a match.
Or like recycle back into the program. Sometimes if you get program income, you can just use it, but you have to use it on the same things. Like
Oh,
to extend the, maybe next time it's $250 or a little less or whatever, it offsets costs or something.
Yeah, so I would definitely ask about that as a match.
okay.
Program income's always very tricky.
Okay.
All right. I'm gonna throw on Suzanne Cox. Had a question from here earlier about stuff that we could provide later on. So I'm just gonna allow Suzanne. If you're there, Suzanne, you had a question earlier about links or sources we could share with you afterwards. All right, maybe on mute at the moment. but I definitely did want to throw in here, if in case there's any other last questions, to please note that, there's Suzanne.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had it unmuted.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
I know, I'm completely new to this, so I was hoping you guys would be able to maybe send out some links after we're done regarding the difference in the sub awardees and the contractual, so that I could educate myself a little more on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. That's something like I said, we always I have like a little table I put together a while ago, but I can also send the federal reference document because that is like exactly what you really need to make sure you're following.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I have no previous experience at all, so I'm trying to catch up.
And
Sure.
I think broadly, is it fair to say, Susan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would view a sub awardee as like a partner on the project who's really, boots on the ground with you through the whole thing versus I'm hiring someone to build a fence.
Yep.
So, like if you're tag teaming with somebody on a project, chances are they're going to be a sub awardee.
Okay,
100%.
great. Great, thank you.
All right, let's see if we have any other last quick questions. Does anyone else have any other questions they wanted to have asked before we finish concluding? Feel free to just either raise your hand, send in the chat, Q&A, and give one last second here. I'm also dropping in to the chat my email address. And what I recommend is that if you are interested, we're going to make sure that we collect all the information, like the slides that were here today, the presentation, all of this stuff we're going to try to have live on our on the CCP website. But once we have some more of those documentation and some of these other things, we will let those know who is on this webinar today. Be aware of when we post those, and make sure that that is sent out to you. Just sent out a reminder that where those are available. And I know Carolyn and Susan were going to get some other resources and even try to type out some of the answers to the questions that were typed up, so that you can either watch this and also have that there as well. Those might take a little bit longer, but once we get those up, we will make sure that we let you know as well. The other reason I wanted to post this is because we have, if you would be interested, especially as I mentioned the Federal Funding Navigator earlier on with CCP, one of the things that we would love for you to do, and I'm going to try to also drop it in to the chat here in 1 second, is our partnership form. And if you would be interested in learning more about Chesapeake Conservation Partnership and becoming a partner with us, so you can get some of those more information on things like our Federal Funding Navigator, our action alerts, and many of the other programs and other webinar opportunities like this. We would love to have you join us and talk to you more about that. So you can contact that email, or I'm going to also drop in the link here in just 1 second. It looks like we also had one other question from Karen in here. If so, any additional info and tips, volunteer groups working to apply for grants would be much appreciated. Some of the sounds overwhelming for volunteers to attempt, but there are many excellent and worthy volunteer projects for funding. So can definitely keep that in mind. Let me see if I can just quickly drop in our thing here, and then is there any other quick questions anyone like to jump in? In fact, I'm gonna for the end here have Ben come back on just for 1 second, just so that he can welcome you guys off as well. So 1 second.
And while you're waiting for Ben, just a thought for Karen. I think I would see if you can start small with the grants and work your way up. Some grants are, $5,000 to $25,000 and way less onerous and terrifying to apply for. And will help you start to pull together, the paperwork and the documents and the collateral materials, etc., and then build from there. You know, if you're an all volunteer group who's never done a grant, I don't know that diving into a complex federal grant is where I would start. Just thinking out loud.
Yeah, I totally agree, Carolyn. And then the reporting requirements are going to be equally, are going to be, should be easier on the back end as well.
Way easier.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
And I'm dropping in that link now, but go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I just first of all, I want to take a moment to give a huge thank you to you, Chase, Carolyn, and Suzanne. You did I think that was incredibly informational and really helpful, I hope, to folks. And if folks want to learn more and get more involved, please do reach out to us. We're hoping to do more of these types of things, and let us also know, what kind of financial technical assistance kind of pieces might be most helpful. I also want to give a big thank you to our sponsors, especially our main supporter, the National Park Service, for making this possible here today.
All right, unless there's any last questions, I'm looking through it. It looks like we are pretty much at that time as far as the questions, everything else. So thank you all for joining us today. Again, we will make sure we let you know once the materials are available, and we have everything posted. If you want to, real quick, I'll keep the window open for just another minute or two, because while I'm collecting stuff, but feel free to grab my email or the partner form link off of there. And we thank you all for joining us today. And thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Chase. Thank you, Susan.